Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just wanted to do this quick introductory video. We lose a class this week due to the break and want to be able to get us to a certain point so when we come back from break we have one topic to do before the AP exam. So we're a little tight this week, and so some of the content I'm going to address outside of class and kind of a flipped classroom type of environment. I think it's doable. This will be very short, and it's also helpful if you happen to be absent. You can use this as an introduction. We're going to be looking at the market model of oligopoly. For us, this is the last of the 4 market models. Remember that we did perfect competition, which is the market where there is so much competition that one firm really has a very small kind of role in the entire market, and they're a price taker. All of the other markets would be called imperfect competition. The most extreme would be a pure monopoly where there's only one firm and the firm is the market. Monopolistic competition is what we spent the last few days doing. Monopolistic competition where there's a great deal of competition and firms are competing largely on things other than price, like the quality of their product, and that's where we see the demand curve shifting for various competitors when firms enter or exit. The last market that we're going to be addressing is oligopoly, which is going to be a market model where there are a few dominant firms. This might be a market where 4 or 5 firms dominate. You can also have multiple competitors, but still have 4 or 5 dominant firms. In cereal production, for example, there might be a variety of cereals, but many of them are actually produced by about 4 different larger companies, right? So, we might look at that as an oligopoly type industry. Certainly like cell phone carriers, you might ask around, and kind of get an idea of who your friends might have for their cell phone carrier. Certainly there's only a few, right? We don't have hundreds and hundreds of different cell phone carriers. It's like AT&T or Verizon or maybe, T-Mobile or whatever the other options are. Some characteristics of oligopolies, a few large producers. This is the most significant characteristic. Unlike monopoly, there's not just one, there's a few, but we do have a few different types of graphs that oligopolies can present as. A few companies can merge together and collude. Okay, of course, this is illegal. This is not something that companies are allowed to do. It's a violation of antitrust, but they can collude to create a pure monopoly model and essentially behave like a monopoly or profit maximizing monopoly. But of course, oligopolies can also compete against each other, and that gives us a different type of outcome. So if AT&T and T-Mobile are competing for you to be their customers, then that's a very different model than if they were to collude together, which again is illegal, but there may be like tacit forms of collusion that firms still take part in, even though it's not supposed to be something that is legal. A couple of other characteristics. With oligopoly, we might have homogeneous or identical products. Steel industry, for example, has a homogeneous product. It is more oligopolistic than it is something that's perfectly competitive. You also can have differentiated products. So cell service might be differentiated. Some might be more quality than others. You might also have, cereal or automobiles would be another example of there's 4 or 5 major automobile producers in the U.S. at least, without, say, foreign competition. Even with foreign competition, it's still largely a few firms that dominate that particular industry, but they produce a differentiated product. There are high barriers to entry, and oftentimes this is because of economies of scale. If I wanted to start, to compete with, an airplane manufacturer, right, I can't easily because it requires a great deal of upfront money and incredible scale to produce, an airplane, right? It's not something you can just do overnight. So high barriers to entry. Another thing is that the oligopoly, like the monopoly and monopolistic competition, will be a price maker. They will have control over price. A really significant feature of oligopoly is mutual interdependence. Because there's only a few firms, right? Think of like your soda market. You have Coca-Cola, you have Pepsi, you have a few other large firms. These firms care a lot about what everybody else is doing. Coca-Cola might decide that they're going to open a new product. They're going to have some sort of fancy new Coca-Cola product, but they would only do that keeping in mind what their competitors are going to do. In this case, because there's so few competitors, you care a lot about what the other guy is doing. That is a major feature. We call that mutual interdependence. So those are key features. Firms, in order to address their mutual interdependence, have to be strategic. They have to consider what the other firm might do, and they might behave differently depending on what the other firm does. This is where we see a little bit of game theory being involved. If I'm Coca-Cola and I know Pepsi is going to advertise, I might make a decision on whether, my firm is going to advertise or not. And if I know the other firm isn't going to advertise, that might affect my decision. So firms make decisions in light of what other firms are likely to do. And that is very much a feature of oligopoly. And these are some examples. OPEC, which is not an American organization. It is a group of petroleum exporting countries. That particular group is an oligopoly. They actually do collude. They sit down and decide what the price of their oil exports will be, and they decide as a group of countries, and they're actually very open about it. They have agreements, and that's how they enforce their particular oligopoly model, which is collusive in nature. They agree to operate as a monopoly. Cereal companies, car producers, cell phones, these are all firms that are largely strategic, and rather than operate as a monopoly, they compete against each other using game theory. The last slide that we're going to note, this one, and I'm sorry, one other one, just for this intro, oligopolies occur largely because of economies of scale. And this would be applicable, say, in the car industry. You really can't compete, with GM in making cars, out of your garage. You just don't have the scale to do that. And in order to get the scale to do that, requires a great deal of investment. It creates a barrier to entry. This was like similar to what I mentioned before about airplanes. If I was going to, kind of whatever, compete with Boeing or something like that. High startup costs, another type of barrier to entry. If whatever industry it is has incredibly high startup fixed costs, generally that's something that's a barrier to entry. And then ownership of raw materials. If the, maybe diamonds or something like that might be an oligopoly, maybe De Beers, diamonds, maybe even a monopoly at one point. If one firm owns the raw materials, they have exclusive, rights to that. And so in an oligopoly situation, sometimes only a few firms, have access to particular raw materials. And because of that access, they're an oligopoly. This is the last slide that we'll note, and this is really all about measuring oligopolies. How do we know the difference between a market, if it's operating in monopolistic competition, where we're saying, firms compete with each other, they have a graph that looks a little bit like monopoly, where MR is less than demand, and we know that there is ease of entry and exit. What does that look like compared to an oligopoly, where we don't really have ease of entry and exit? Doesn't mean nobody can get in or get out. It just means that it's not as easy to. So how do we really differentiate between a market that's an oligopoly and a market that's monopolistic competition? How do we draw that line? Well, there's a few different ways to do that. So if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, you can see the concentration ratio formula. This is one way to actually measure if an industry is an oligopoly. So what we might do is do the 4-firm concentration ratio. You take every single one of the top 4 firms in an industry. So say that we were doing cell phones, and we might say, okay, the number one, cell phone carrier is, AT&T or whatever, and it has 25% of the market. The next one has 10% of the market, then 10% of the market. If we actually kind of say the top 4 firms have at least 60% of the market. In the example that we have here, the concentration ratio is 50%. So 4 firms have 50% of the market, and maybe a number of firms are sharing the rest of the market share. If we have a market share that's greater than 60, we often describe that as an oligopoly. And that's a very simple, formula. You're just like adding up percentages of market share for the top 4 firms in a particular market. You also can do the same thing using 8 firms. Okay, so if we said, okay, the top firm carries 50% of the market, the next firm carries, 48% of the market. The next firm carries 1%, and the next firm carries 1%, right? There are problems with the 4 firm concentration ratio, the 8 firm concentration ratio. For this reason, it is really hard to tease out the differences between a market that has 2 firms that dominate the entire industry with 50% of the market, 48% of the market, than if we had 4 firms that had 25% of the market. In other words, this market here with 2 firms that kind of have a duopoly, or 2 firms that are sharing the market share, it's a very different market than this market where there's 4 firms that each have 25% of the market share. It's a very, very different model. This top one is a little bit closer to a monopolistic type market where there's only 2 firms that have most of the market share. But in the 4 firm concentration ratio, these 2 industries would be treated exactly the same. They essentially are 4 firms that have 100% of the market share. Both are oligopolies, which they are, but they're also very different types of oligopolies. So sometimes we use what's called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. It's a little bit more sophisticated of a way to measure whether or not an industry is an oligopoly. This is a measurement that might get used before mergers. Say the Federal Trade Commission might use the HHI example to figure out, for instance, if Office Max and Staples were to merge, how much of the market share together would they have? And also is used in court cases about antitrust. So whenever there's a court case, oftentimes the HHI is used. So it's the chosen way of figuring out if an industry is an oligopoly. The way that this is done is you can have any number of firms in an industry. So even if we said, well, we want to know if this industry is monopolistic competition or oligopoly, maybe there's like 30 firms, right? We take the top 4 firms, okay, the top 4 firms, and we figure out the market share for those top firms, right? So say it's 30%, 30%, 20%, and 20%. In terms of figuring out the HHI, we square each of those percentages. So we're getting a chance to see, not only whether or not this is an oligopoly, but what the industry looks like in terms of weighting each one of these percentages. Okay, so 30 squared plus 30 squared plus 20 squared plus 20 squared gives us a figure of 2,600. The highest HHI that you can have is 10,000. If a monopoly had 100% of the industry and then you squared that, the HHI would be 10,000. So on a scale of like 1 to 10,000, what could you have for an HHI? If we see this number is about 2,600, and you could add in every single firms, okay? So you can, if there were 60 firms, you can actually, with this formula, you can add in, all 60 firms, and you get a sense of where the dominant firms are because they're weighted more heavily. And if you have a number that's greater than 2,500, we generally consider that highly concentrated, aka oligopoly, and that's according to the Department of Justice. It doesn't necessarily mean if a industry has an HHI of greater than 2,500 that they're automatically, busted up or something like that. But that number tends to be indicative of an oligopoly. Okay, if you have questions about that, just bring your questions to class.